A young woman, Ava, races to meet her fiancé David's reclusive, notoriously strict billionaire father, Arthur Sterling. On the way she stops to feed and warm a shivering homeless man, giving him her lunch and a cashmere scarf. She arrives late in panic. The homeless man is revealed to be Arthur in disguise. Arthur has been testing people for true character. Ava's kindness wins his approval, humiliating David, who had obsessed over appearances and his father's approval. The story ends with reconciliation and a modest wedding where Arthur honors Ava's values. The juxtaposition of high stakes, wealthy world pressure versus a simple act of kindness, sandwich plus scarf. The ticking clock and Ava's race creates tension and sympathy. The reveal, the homeless man is Arthur, unexpected, satisfying reversal. David's public humiliation and private breakdown generate emotional payoff and growth. The warm final scene, scarf returned, small wedding, provides catharsis. Clear moral, kindness beats status. Universally appealing. Surprise twist, benevolent billionaire in disguise, great shareability. Short, emotionally tight scenes ideal for Reels/YouTube shorts. Strong visual contrasts, mansion versus park bench, cashmere versus threadbare jacket. Relatable stakes, meeting the in-laws, fear of judgment. The billionaire in disguise twist is familiar and risks predictability if not freshened. David's transformation feels accelerated, his breakdown and epiphany could use deeper internal work. Some exposition-heavy lines, lawyer email, list of rules, slow early momentum. The father's testing backstory is told rather than gradually revealed, less showing, more telling. Dialogue sometimes telegraphs moral lessons rather than allowing subtlety. Ground Arthur's motives with a brief, concrete memory or small ritual, show a recall of why he tests people, instead of long monologue. Give David a clearer, defensible fear, make his dependency on approval sympathetic to avoid one-dimensional cruelty. Show, don't tell, reveal rules through a short rehearsal scene or a text exchange rather than explicit list. Subvert the twist slightly, Arthur may not be fully benevolent, hint at past regrets to add complexity. Tighten pacing, cut excess exposition, open with a striking image or line to pull viewers instantly. Adults 18 to 45 who enjoy short emotional dramas and feel-good twist stories. Viewers of short-form platforms, TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, who like moral surprises and family drama content. Audiences who enjoy romantic drama with a moral/character test, rom-com adjacent. The train hissed as if tired of carrying city people to small-town facades. Ava watched the window frame world blur, manicured hedges, stone lions guarding secret drives, lawns kept like museum rooms. Her phone vibrated once, David, please be perfect. Don't be late. She closed her eyes and practiced the shape of her smile until the muscles felt rehearsed rather than honest. The invitation had the sterile politeness of a subpoena. Mr. Arthur Sterling requests the presence of Mr. David Sterling and Ms. Ava Peters for dinner. The gravity of the line unsettled her, it wasn't an ask. It was a weighing. 2 years of quiet love had been distilled into one meal. She had read the list David gave her, don't mention the non-profit, don't bring up parents, we're Navy, don't be late, and folded each instruction into a nervous knot. Tonight, she was to be flawless costume and script. It felt like auditioning for a life she already lived. When the station doors opened, the air smelled of clipped grass and something metallic. She had 20 minutes to make 20 minutes feel like an hour. Ava chose to walk, a decision half made to steady her pulse, half made to feel like an ordinary human moving through an extraordinary landscape. The town felt staged, the houses loomed like private museums, their gates insistent on keeping the world outside. On a tucked-away green between two gates, an old man sat small and disordered on a park bench. His coat hung open like a tired flag. He shivered in a wind that seemed to take the warmth out of the afternoon. For a moment she could be the woman tightened by rules, the one who walked past. David's voice returned, appearances matter. But another voice, a grandmother's, answered from memory, measure people by what they do when nothing's at stake. The sandwich in her bag was the only fixed thing she had planned for her day, a simple turkey and Swiss wrapped like an afterthought. She had planned it for herself, a modest comfort on a nervous evening. She knelt and offered it. His eyes, an unexpectedly clear blue, lifted to her with a look that was not plea but careful surprise. "Miss, I missed the shelter lunch," he said. His voice was a paper whisper. She unwrapped the sandwich and draped her cashmere scarf around his shoulders without thinking of cost or consequence. The scarf felt heavy with what it signified, David's insistence, the polished image she was supposed to carry, but she pulled it closed around the old man and the world fell into sharper focus. He said, simply, "Thank you." It was a normal human exchange, small as breath. Then panic returned in a cold tide. Her watch read 5:12 p.m., 12 minutes past perfect. She had already failed the thing that mattered in David's ledger. Her heels found the road in that particular, urgent rhythm people have when choices tilt futures. The gates of the Sterling estate rose like cathedral doors. She announced herself, voice thin, and the intercom buzzed like a verdict. The drive inward felt like descending into legend, oaks like pillars, marble glimpses through trimmed hedges, the house growing larger until it took up her whole sight. At the portico, David stood by the stairs, winded and white as a reprimand. His hand grabbed hers, firm, not gentle. He counted the minutes with an accusation. His face, usually an anchor, was a rawness of fear. "You're 17 minutes late." The number landed and sent a small shock through her chest. Her small act of mercy had become an offense. But beneath the disappointment she saw something else in him, panic that was not about etiquette but about a father whose approval felt like survival. He led her inside like a shepherd pulling a lamb to an uncertain altar. The house smelled of old money and varnish, every portrait glancing not at them but past them, cataloguing. They walked under chandeliers that were more like constellations stored in glass. David's whispered instructions slivered into the cool air, "Don't talk about charity, don't mention family," but Ava's mind was still on the old man's hands around the scarf. She had lost punctuality but had kept her humanity. In that tight heartbeat, an odd calm steadied her, one born of a choice she had already made, regardless of consequences. The dining room felt less like a room and more like a stage. A single table stretched long as a hallway of consequence, flanked by chairs that seemed to measure status by how far they were from the head. Arthur Sterling occupied the throne at the far end, a slim silhouette against the dark polished wood. His voice, when he spoke, was a low thing that could be either invitation or verdict. There was a place set before him but no other guests, the emptiness itself carried weight. David's mouth made a series of rigid arrangements, handshakes, smiles, practiced small talk, and his agitation threaded everything he did. Ava watched him perform his way through rituals, and pity mixed with frustration in her chest like a bad perfume. He fussed with the hem of her dress, smoothed an invisible smudge from her sleeve, and mouthed the list of forbidden topics as if exorcising a demon. "Just be perfect," he whispered. He believed perfection could be bought, or at least borrowed, from labels and rehearsed lines. Arthur's eyes were a strike of something unexpected, warm and clear, too shrewd for the anonymity the world had given him. He didn't rise to greet them, but the silence wasn't cold, it felt like a held breath. The butler, a thin moving shadow, spoke an opening line, an offer to begin, and the room accepted like an audience finally settling. Conversation began awkwardly. David tried to build scaffolding, safe topics, weather, and neutral admiration for landscapes. Ava felt like she was walking a wire strung tight across a chasm of judgment. The old rules David had handed her in the week before sprung to life in the tiny corrections he made, an anxious drone, no charities, no humble backgrounds, firmness in tone. But Arthur interrupted the scaffolding with something small, a question about a book she was reading. It was a pivot, intimate, unexpected, and disarming. She told him, halting at first, about the community garden project and the kids who came to learn how soil wasn't just dirt but memory. She described the feel of young palms turning earth, the way a student's face lit when a seed broke open. Arthur listened as if each word was currency he was appraising for character rather than value. He asked precise follow-ups, how they trained the volunteers, what resources they needed, and when she admitted funding struggles he didn't recoil. There was no sneer at non-profit. Instead he asked, plain, why do you do it? Ava found herself telling a story about dinner-table conversations with her parents, her mother at a bedside, her father reading under poor light, and how those small, unspectacular lives taught a certain stubbornness of care. Speaking made the nerves ease, the words were scaffolding for a different kind of courage. Across the table, David's jaw tightened. He could see nothing but the risk, that his fiancée's modesty and compassion might become an indictment of everything he had been trying to protect, a polished image, a stairway into a family of power. Arthur's manner remained curiously gentle. He probed, not to humiliate, but to measure. He spoke rarely about his empire, instead he carved out curiosity, an old man who watched for integrity as if it were a rare bird. When he reached for a glass of water, his hand shook just slightly, the tremor of a man who had learned weight. It made him more human than the portraits around him, and that humanization felt like a softening of an entire myth. Outside, the mansion held its breath. Inside, thin threads of conversation wound tighter, about values, small mercies, what people keep even when they have nothing. David kept trying to steer the talk back to safer shores, art, surface praise, compliments that were measured and commercial. Each deflection felt like a small betrayal of the momentum toward truth. Arthur allowed the stray currents, he wanted the raw beneath the polite. As the courses moved from plates of glistening restraint to something richer, an unspoken current moved the room. Ava sensed a pattern. Arthur didn't punish novelty. He rewarded proof. What mattered was less what you said than what you'd done when no one watched. The scarf, the sandwich, in her mind they were already small anchors, gestures that would not be undone by polished linens. David, however, watched them like a man witnessing his own undoing, his obsession tightening into a visible edge. When Arthur finally leaned forward, the room seemed to balance on a single hinge. His voice carried a soft amusement. "Tell me about the day you decided to do this work," he said to Ava, not to David. The question demanded a scene, a turning point. Ava described a rainy afternoon when a child planted a seed with sticky fingers and asked, in all innocence, whether the plant would forgive them. The simplicity of the memory drew a smile from some corner of Arthur's face. David's fingers dug into the table under the guise of stillness. This was less an interview and more an anatomy. At the table's far reaches, the atmosphere shifted. Arthur's gentle probing had peeled away the artifice and left something raw and true. David, who had spent a week teaching scripts and lines, was suddenly outside the play. The house, with its portraits and opulence, lowered its volume. The test, if it had been one, revealed itself not as barrier but as sieve. Ava's choices, made earlier on the green, had collected small proof of what she was like when the spotlight was off. The hour moved, and with it, a hinge creaked somewhere invisible, secrecy toward revelation. The butler's footsteps softened as plates were cleared and the air thinned, leaving only voices that mattered. Arthur pushed back his chair with a sound like a small declaration. He reached up and smoothed the worn scarf at his neck, an almost devotional gesture, and for the first time that evening his eyes fixed on David with a look that was not merely paternal but precise, forensic. David bristled, the way someone does when a private wound is about to be displayed under fluorescent truth. "Ava," Arthur said, startlingly direct, "tell me exactly what happened this afternoon." The sentence was polite, but the room tightened as if someone pulled a curtain closed. Ava repeated the story, walking from the station, the park bench, the shiver, each word crisp as a coin placed on a ledger. She described the ordinary exchange, the sandwich unwrapped, the scarf draped without a calculation. The details landed with gentle force, the kind that transforms anecdote into evidence. David's face went through micro-expressions, anger, disbelief, then a slow, roby fear. "You were talking to a homeless man," he whispered, more to himself than to her. His voice carried an accusation as old as privilege, that charity is spectacle, that compassion must have beneficiaries with returns. You gave him my scarf, he added, voice pitched toward accusation and hurt. The currency of his panic was not the scarf itself but what it represented, an unplanned abstraction of dignity, an exposure of his own insecurity. Arthur listened, hands folded, the picture of a man who had seen 1,000 rehearsed confessions. He allowed the silence to do its work, letting the moral calculus rearrange itself in the empty spaces between sentences. Then, with a small, almost private smile, he tipped his head toward the single-place setting opposite him. The butler, precise as a metronome, opened the doors at the far end with the soft authority of theater stagehands revealing a consequence. Into the doorway walked the same man from the park bench, but he wore the posture of someone who belonged in no one's script. He moved slow, deliberate, and when he crossed the threshold, the room shivered as if a truth had walked in among them. The scarf around his shoulders was unmistakable, a slash of quiet luxury against threadbare coats, and it settled around his neck with the nobility of a flag. Ava's stomach dropped to a hollow thinness. For a moment, the world condensed into the space between their eyes. David's face drained. He looked as though someone had shown him an old photograph of himself he didn't recognize. "Father," he said, voice cracked with something like panic and pleading. The man from the bench, Arthur, smiled with a tenderness that made his son's fear look small and brittle. "Welcome, Ava," Arthur said to her, as if greeting an old friend at the door of an ordinary house. His tone turned toward her warmth that made the whole room unsteady. The reveal wasn't a villainous trick, it was a deliberate, gentle exposure. Arthur had not posed simply to humiliate. He had become something else, an instrument to measure if the small mercies of a stranger were real. Where others might have indulged in a grand monologue, Arthur did not perform a lecture. He instead described, in short, almost offhand remarks, how he had spent years watching people when they thought themselves unseen, because the value of a person, he believed, was most visible in those private acts. The scarf, he said, had come from his coat room, an old, soft thing kept for the rarest of nights. He wrapped it around his shoulders in the park by chance and waited. Not cruelty. An experiment, he called it, a way not to expose but to observe. David's chest heaved. He shrank as if colliding with a mural of his own inadequacies. His privilege had trained him to control optics, his father trained him to face unvarnished truth. The young man's anger curdled into something else, grief, the grief of someone raised to need approval as if survival hinged on it. He looked small and lost under his father's calm gaze, and in that shrinking there was a quiet, necessary dismantling. Arthur's praise of Ava was not performative. He described her gesture plainly, warmth for a stranger, food for an empty stomach, comfort without calculation, and called it the most valuable, rarest currency he knew. He praised the decision that had been made on the green, not the minute drama at the steps. "You failed the petty test," he told David, "but she passed the only one that counted." The sentence landed like a bell, resonant and final. The twist was not merely that the homeless man was Arthur but that his guise reframed the entire litany of expectations. The reveal forced David and Ava into a different ledger, one where acts outshine appearances, and where the very things David feared would disqualify them were the qualities Arthur prized. For Ava, the moment was dizzying and luminous. For David, it was a reckoning. The rest of the evening would be an unspooling of truths, apologies, and the slow, careful work of reordering what it meant to belong. After the reveal, the house did not fall into chaos. Instead, it reoriented itself around a quieter gravity. Plates were not pushed away in drunken triumph, conversations folded into measured threads. Arthur's voice, low and precise, traversed the space between lesson and confession. He invited Ava to sit beside him, not as an honored prop but as a witness to an alternative measurement of worth. David retreated to the far end of the table like a man seeking exile in familiar shame. The contrast between his posture and Ava's steady, open composure felt like a study in coordinates, one person shrinking under exposure, the other standing by the consequences of their choice. The butler moved with the same discreet intent, filling goblets and arranging cutlery as if ritual could re-anchor the world. Yet rituals could not undo the new terrain Arthur had created, one where kindness trumped curated facades. Arthur asked direct questions, not to embarrass but to understand. When have you had to choose between convenience and compassion? What would you do if your values cost you a place at a table? Each inquiry was a scalpel, precise and compassionate. Ava answered with small scenes, a night staying late to teach a child to read, raising funds without glitter, kneeling in dirt with seedlings the kids called our future. She spoke of obligations that didn't require applause, of choosing to be seen when it was quieter to hide. David heard these stories like a man hearing an unfamiliar language. His defensiveness was a shield and, in this hour, a prison. He let his discomfort show, fingers drumming, jaw tight, but when it came time to speak, the words he found were thinly veiled recriminations. You knew what this meant to me, he said, voice raw, and you chose that. The ellipsis held all the accusations unspoken, that she had chosen a stranger over his ladder, a sandwich over their planned future. Arthur did not soften to sentimentalism, he reframed. Approval has long been my currency, he said quietly. I looked for honesty where it could not be faked. He described the parade of candidates he had observed over the years, slick talk, precise smiles, practiced sympathies, and how none offered the unglamorous courage of a simple act. It is easy to applaud charity at a gala, he said. It is rare to be kind when it costs nothing you can reclaim. This was the moment the house itself watched, a scale tilted not by fortune but by moral gravity. David's shame balked against the weight of being shown wrong not by argument but by living example. He had been protecting an identity, polished, acceptable, familial. That identity was exposed as brittle. He flailed with resentment, then desperation, then a slow, breaking vulnerability that replaced bluster with tearful apology. I taught you a script because I thought it would keep you safe, he said, voice small. I thought if I controlled the optics, he'd accept us. I wanted to belong to my father's world, and I forgot how to be my own. The admission cracked something open. It was not a grand conversion but a human unraveling, less cinematic, and therefore more true. Ava reached across the table with a silence that said, without words, she had already chosen him before this night and the choice still stood. Arthur's gaze stayed on David with an inscrutable tenderness that carried neither indulgence nor cruelty. You have been living in a shadow, he said, chasing an approval you never understood fully. Tonight you saw a woman measure herself in compassion, not costume. You may either learn or continue to perform. The ultimatum was quiet but devastating, an invitation to adulthood. David's collapse into apology and confession was a messy, necessary thing. He spoke of his fear of being less than his father's expectations, of how the family name felt like a ledger of worth. He admitted to policing Ava's answers and, with shame, to moments when he had tried to edit the truth of his life. Each admission peeled away a layer of performance. Arthur listened and then, slowly, offered a different instruction: be present, be accountable, and stop expecting love's validation to arrive like a dividend. The terms were harsh but honest. They were not about banishment but about a re-education in values. For David, the notion that his father valued character over optics was both balm and punishment. He had to reconcile pride with humility. Ava watched the exchange, listening to the man she loved confront the man he had been raised to please, and felt a complex swell of emotions: compassion for David, relief at Arthur's unexpected integrity, and a quiet relief that her earlier choice had not been naive but decisive. The evening moved toward a rare space where humility and power conversed, and neither side had the upper hand. That balanced tension prepared them for the inevitable closing, a decision that would define whether love would survive the real work of being true. Silence pooled at the table as Arthur rose, the slow motion of a man deciding to alter a life with one small gesture. He took off the cashmere scarf and folded it with reverence, a deliberate unwrapping of meaning. I kept this, he said, looking at David, not to keep warm, but to see who would notice it wasn't mine. The sentence landed like a verdict, gentle, precise, irreducible. Then he did something unexpected. He handed the scarf to Ava. It was not a theatrical gift, it was restitution and a symbol. You gave what you had, he said simply. You gave warmth without ledger, comfort without expectation. That is charity and courage both. Ava felt the fabric like a benediction, soft, warm, and carrying the weight of a choice recognized. David's reaction was a rupture. He tried to protest the humiliation he felt and the unmoored pride that would not bend easily. But protest met a steadier force. Arthur's voice was not cruel, it was clarifying. I have watched you, son, he said. I have watched you try to manufacture the world you wanted to inherit. Tonight you learned that the world measures by different units. I cannot give you this lesson, you must learn it. I can only offer the consequence. Those words were the blade that cut through pretenses. David's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Ava as if seeing her anew, not just the woman he'd planned to present to the world, but the person who had grounded herself in action. He apologized, at first clumsy, then truthful. He named his fear, his mistake, and his regret. His voice broke under the strain of being small and honest at once. Arthur did not soften into paternal indulgence. Instead he acknowledged Ava with a clarity that felt like blessing. You can marry my son, he said, turning to David with a firmness that felt like a hand on the shoulder, if you can stop being a child about my opinion. The command was not cruel, it was a call to adulthood. David's transformation was not instant heroism. It was a cracking open, a messy, painful admitting that his hunger for approval had cost him the freedom to be present. Tears came, not as theatrical performance but as human surrender. He promised, clumsily and soberly, to recalibrate his life, to stop editing the truth of who he loved and to start living the way his partner already acted. Ava accepted the scarf, then pushed it back, an emblem of something more than material. Keep it, she said. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Her voice was steady, it cut through the air like a compass. Wear it when you need to remember that warmth isn't a transaction. The room, which had been taut with tension moments before, relaxed into something like relief. Arthur's approval was not a coronation of Ava into his world but an integration of values, a recognition that wealth without conscience was poverty. For David, the humiliation became a beginning instead of an end, a catalyst for sincere change. Outside, wind moved the oaks like a knowing audience. Inside, plates were cleared with less ceremony, and conversation tilted toward the practical, wedding plans, not as displays of status but as a merging of lives. Arthur spoke of business only briefly, as if his true work had always been the subtler domain of character. He proposed not power but partnership. If David could learn to be accountable and humble, Arthur would support them, not to control, but to enable. The climax was not about punishing David or elevating Ava to a moral pedestal, it was an insistence on truth. The scarf, the sandwich, the small mercy on the bench, these became a parable in a home that had long confused spectacle with substance. The night closed on a note that felt like a verdict and a benediction rolled into one. Love that endures is one that can survive humiliation and is willing to change. The wedding was quiet as breath. Not at a country club, but beneath the humble canopy of Ava's parents' backyard, strings of lights like constellations stitched low and close. Arthur arrived in a tailored suit, the cashmere scarf folded neatly over his arm like a relic that belonged to private memory rather than public display. He moved through the small crowd with a softness that surprised everyone who'd ever imagined him a mountain of implacable judgment. David stood at the altar with the pallor of someone who had learned humility and was still learning how to hold it. His hands trembled as he took Ava's, not from nerves alone but from gratitude for a woman whose choice that day had become a lodestar. When he spoke his vows, his voice was rough with the truth, admitting his old mistakes and promising daily attentions rather than grand gestures. Arthur watched with eyes that had been softened by revelation and years. When his turn came to speak, he did not give a sermon, he offered a simple confession. I tested people because I feared being disappointed, he said. I mistook performance for character. His words were a small surrender, the kind that reorders a household. Then, with a tremor of warmth, he told Ava he was proud to call her family, not because she had passed some social gauntlet but because she had chosen kindness when it was hardest. The reception that followed was modest in scale but extravagant in sincerity. Laughter threaded the air like music. Children ran near the hedges, a comic and tender ballet. The cake was home-style, the speeches spare, each anecdote a braid of lives now braided properly. Ava's parents beamed with that private kind of pride that no portrait can capture. David's face, once carved by fear of inheriting legacy, was now open, less starched by the anxiety of optics. Arthur pulled Ava aside near the edge of the lights and, with a careful reverence, draped the scarf across her shoulders for a moment. "It was a good decision," he said, and the words felt like an heirloom. "Keep being who you are." He left the scarf as a small, symbolic stitch between two families, a reminder that warmth circulates freely if allowed. Later, as the night waned and people drifted toward cars and quiet conversations, David and Ava stood beneath an oak and watched the breath of their new life fog in the cool air. They spoke not with the grandiosity of future plans but with tender practicalities, a farmer's market on Saturdays, visits to the community garden, time carved out for small rituals. They promised to argue and to return, each time, to the habit of listening. The story closed not with a showy pronouncement but with a simple shot, the scarf folded over a wooden fence post, drying in the moonlight. It was ordinary and effective, all at once. A small emblem of the whole lesson, that true wealth is not a ledger but the warmth you leave behind. The camera, if there were one, would hold on the tiny, soft knit for a beat longer, then lift to see the couple walking home, hands intertwined, not because the world had approved but because they had chosen each other again and again. In the end, Arthur's experiment was less a trick than a mirror. It reflected what had been hiding in plain sight, the quiet courage of small mercies and the work it takes for humans to become larger than their fears. The future, once a ledger of expectations, became instead a ledger of effort, and that, for all of them, felt like a fortune.